Hi, today we're going to talk about the difference between goats versus sheep. Now, a lot of you are starting out with a homestead farm or you have a small farm, you want to get a farm, you're not sure which livestock to get. So today I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons of having sheep and or goats. I'm going to start out with goats. Initially, when I bought the farm, I was looking for some animals to clear out some underbrush and heavy use areas that had since overgrown. And a friend of ours had some goats that they wanted to give us. So we took them in, and they were pets for two of my children. They were crosses. It was Nigerian dwarf, Kiko, and Cashmere, and they were friendly goats. And so if you're a dog person, goats definitely are very entertaining. They're fun to have around, and my children really enjoyed having them. If you like to interact with your animals, other than feeding them or just patting them, goats are very interactive, and so therefore you might want to consider goats. They're fun. They're fun. Goats are fun, and definitely goat kids are very entertaining to watch. We did have a lot of success with them as far as cleaning out some dense undergrowth, particularly scrub pines and junipers. They'd eat dead leaves in the fall, and they really got rid of a lot of obnoxious weeds. And some of the things that are actually toxic to sheep and cows aren't toxic to goats, and so the goats had no problem, tearing those out. One of the early challenges that I had with goats was keeping them contained, and so initially, the pens in the barn that had been designed for sheep, the goats, they were sailing out of those. So we ended up building gates that were taller than me. So we had basically a Nigerian dwarf goat, which stands about 2.5 foot tall, jumping over a 5 to 6 foot enclosure. So that presented a whole bunch of challenges. And we had a horse at the time and a cow, and so we thought that electric fencing, as in wired fencing, would keep the goats in because they would stay with the cow and the horse. Well, that wasn't necessarily true. And it didn't matter how many strands of electric wire we had, somehow the goats were either through it or over it. The goats are browsers, so they tend to reach up and eat things at eye level, or they are really great at rearing up on their hind legs and putting their front legs on whatever they want to eat, and then reaching and grabbing that. So that presented some problems with fencing as well, because when I decided to put up some woven wire fences, I started to have problems with the fences getting pushed over, and that's because the goats were in areas where there were apple trees or leaves or branches on the other side that the goats wanted. They were standing on the fence and reaching over, and then we resulted with the fences getting pushed over. After a little bit, we got some boar goats, and she wasn't jumping over fences. She was very tame, and she would come to us, and just a very friendly, well-mannered, nice goat. But the problem with her is, instead of trying to jump over the fence, she again was pushing on the fence, and so we still had this initial problem of the fences getting pushed over. So in conjunction with that goat and the cow, they ended up letting everybody loose, and they were down the street in my neighbor's flower beds. So we had another problem to deal with. We were really intent on having some goats because everything that I had learned about goats was they were just so great for clearing underbrush. They were even better than sheep. So we got a Nubian, and she was a great goat. We had that one Nubian goat, and she was with the sheep. She self-identified as a sheep, and so therefore she was great. No trouble with her whatsoever. The problem was when we decided that we needed a second goat. So we got a Saanen, again, very sweet and friendly goat. And so the two of them, now all of a sudden they realized that they weren't sheep, and so they would stay off on their own. They weren't flocking with the sheep anymore. And even though we had paddocks, they still weren't necessarily together. Occasionally they would be, at feeding time, but for the most part they were separate and they weren't together. And it really presented a problem with accountability. And so we decided we wanted that Saanen Nubian to be bred and produce milk. We thought we wanted goat milk. And so we got a buck, and the problems started to stem as we went from 1 to 2 to several goats. and the buck, you could smell him before you could see him. He just smelled terrible. It was a vile, raunchy smell. And some people we knew wanted to actually eat goat, so we thought we would get another goat and then harvest the goat to pay for the upkeep of the goats that we had. And so that fall we didn't keep them very long, either about 8 months. We sent that goat off to freezer camp, and he came back, and even though it had some spice, like for meatballs or sausage, it was a vile taste. I just none of us here could develop a taste for it. And even though my friends liked it, I just personally, it wasn't something that we could manage. We decided we weren't really enjoying the taste of goat and the smell of the goat. When the goats finally procreated in the following spring, we had some really cute goat kids. We had the Boer goat still, and she had a nice batch of triplets who were very, very adorable. And we had the Nubian had some babies, and the Saanen had some babies. So suddenly we're a full-fledged goat farm. The place was brimming with goats, right? And all of the problems that we had encountered earlier on, they really exacerbated themselves as the numbers went up with goats. We really tried to make a go of drinking the goat milk, and so the Nubian milk was definitely creamier and more flavorful than the Saanen milk. And even though we were super clean with all the milking machinery and this sanitary environment, it just had a funny taste to it that I could tolerate it. I could talk myself into putting it in cereal, but as far as like the kids going and getting a glass of goat milk, they just weren't having it. I really started to develop a problem with them jumping over the fence at that point. The kids, even though they were so fun to watch, they just were very, very busy, and the fences to them were a jigsaw puzzle that beckoned to be deciphered. They just spent all their waking hours, it seemed to me, just trying to find a way out. And so we have a mixed orchard of some young and old trees, and lo and behold, they had gotten out and then gotten into the orchard, and the goats really love tender bark of young trees. So they girdled several of my peach trees and resulted in the loss of those trees. And even though I tried to have a fence to keep the goats in and then another fence to keep the goats out, ultimately the goats were where I didn't want them. And particularly they were at the neighbor's house across the street. And so we always had a problem with the goats down there. And my neighbor was a really, my neighbor is a yard enthusiast, I call him. He's just very meticulous about his yard. And so lo and behold, my goats were always in his yard, and they were on his deck, messing on his deck. And every time I turned around, I had a flock of sheep and a herd of goats down there in his yard, because the sheep would follow the goats ultimately. And it was a disaster. They were across the road and down the road. I just couldn't keep them in no matter what I did. And so the old adage of, if you take a bucket of water and throw it at a fence, if the water goes through, then the goats can also. That's ultimately been my experience. And so while the goats were very entertaining and they were cute, we ended up getting rid of all the goats. And it was a sad day, particularly for me. I had a couple that was very, attached to. My children were attached to some of them, but we just were very concerned about not being able to contain the goats. And the good fences make good neighbors. I just couldn't construct a fence tall enough or impenetrable enough to keep those goats in. And they were literally on the hoods of my tractors. They were on the roof of my tractor. We decided to send them away. And the funny true story is the guy who came to get the goats, and by that time I think I had about eight or nine goats. And he came down with a Subaru Outback wagon, and he just put all of them on the back seat. And so I must have looked like and smelled like by the time he got to his destination. But if you enjoy dogs and the interaction, and you are used to, say, goat milk or goat milk products, or you like the taste of goat and ultimately you can contain those goats, because I'm not making this up. The fencing for a goat is just a jigsaw puzzle to them, and they just spend all day looking for a way to get to the other side. And then when they're on the other side, it's just a free for all. There's no holes barred about what they're going to get into. But they are definitely great animals to clear out underbrush. And so I had a couple of little goats, and I took them to my mother's house and fenced them in properly, and I didn't have any trouble because they were just tiny. But man, if you've got a whole herd of goats, you better be on your toes and be really diligent about the construction of your facilities, because the goats just the goats really worked hard to get out.